The Detroit Lions have completely revamped their secondary in the 2024 offseason. After a year in 2023 where their cornerbacks ranked bottom of the NFL, where their cornerback one allowed more yardage than anybody in the sport, and a year in which their secondary ranked 27th in the NFL, fifth worst in the league, Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell and Aaron Glenn went into this offseason with one goal. Never, ever let that happen again. And after the way that they've changed this secondary, I think there's a good chance that they become one of the best secondaries and they turn this thing around pretty quickly. However, just because the top of the secondary is secured with Brian Branch and Kirby Joseph and Terrion Arnold and Carlton Davis and all of those guys at the top, there is still a lot of competition and there is still a lot of work to do for the remainder of this secondary, and especially for some of the depth pieces that the Lions are going to keep around. And those are the players that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be taking a look at the entire secondary from cornerback 1 to cornerback 6, from safety 1 to safety 5, and we are going to look at exactly how this secondary is going to play out, the competition that is still very much in play for a lot of these young players, as well as how this secondary is going to potentially look going into 2024. So, starting off with the Detroit Lions secondary a year ago. As I said, they ranked as the 27th best secondary in the NFL, allowing 4,205 yards through the air, as well as 28 passing touchdowns. Now, they were slightly above league average when it came to interceptions and passes defended, ranking 13th in both interceptions and passes defended with 16 and 79, respectively. The secondary was just honestly very poor, right? A lot of those interceptions come from linebackers and some of them come from the defensive line. A lot of those passes defended comes from linebackers as well. So those numbers are slightly inflated due to that. And really overall, just watching the Lions secondary on film, you could tell that they weren't very good. And taking a look at their last 5 games of the NFL season, it was pretty evident that they needed a change at cornerback, right? In week 14, week 15, Justin Jefferson went for 180. In week 16 in Dallas, CeeDee Lamb went for 200. In week 18 versus the Minnesota Vikings at home, Justin Jefferson again went for 150. In the wild card round, Puka Nacua went for 180. In the playoffs in the divisional round, Mike Evans had almost 150 yards through the air. And most of this was put up on Cam Sutton and Kendallvilder. Most of this was due to Kendallvilder and Cam Sutton being arguably the worst cornerback duo in the NFL a season ago. And the Detroit Lions made quite a few changes going into 2024. They traded for Carlton Davis. They signed Amik Robertson. They re-signed Emmanuel Mosley. They drafted Terrion Arnold. They drafted Ennis Rakestraw Jr. They hired a new defensive backs coach, and they have really changed everything about this cornerback room, right? The Lions starting cornerbacks a season ago, Cam Sutton, not on the roster anymore. Their other starting cornerback in Kendallvilder, at best right now, is your cornerback 6 and potentially will not make the roster either. And honestly, going back to 2023, I'm not sure that there is a cornerback on the roster last year that makes the roster this year based off talent alone. I think Cam Sutton obviously would based off of the contract implications, but if you're talking just pure talent and ability to play the cornerback position, I'm not sure a single member of that cornerback room last year makes the roster this year based on just how much talent has been added to this 2024 roster. Now, last season, the 2023 depth chart featured 4 boundary cornerbacks, 2 nickel cornerbacks, and 4 safeties. 10 defensive backs in all to make up this roster. So that's kind of the area that I tried to stick to as of last year, because that's typically how the Detroit Lions like to structure their secondary. It may be a little bit different this year, of course, but that's kind of how I base it as far as the numbers go. Now, the NFL locks for this season, the locks for 2024 are going to be Carlton Davis as cornerback 1, Terrion Arnold as cornerback 2, Amik Robertson at cornerback 3, Ennis Rakestraw at CB4, and Emmanuel Mosley, I would say, is just about guaranteed at CB5. He is a player that probably won't be healthy day 1, so you'll probably have that extra roster spot for the first month or so of the NFL season. But as far as the majority of the NFL season, I do think Mosley will be a prominent backup, and I do think he will be a very, very solid depth player. So although I don't think he's necessarily a lock, I do think he's about a 95% chance to make this roster, especially when healthy. And then your safety positions, I think, are pretty much locked up, barring a major injury throughout the offseason with Kirby Joseph, Ifeatu Melifonwu, Brian Branch, and Brandon Joseph, the standout UDFA from a season ago. That doesn't leave a whole lot of room for other players. That doesn't leave room for another safety, and that really only leaves room for one other cornerback position. The roster hopefuls for this offseason, that's going to be Stephen Gilmore, Shellen Garnes, Khalil Dorsey, Kendallvilder, Lauren Strickton, and CJ Moore. 6 players that I think all have a chance to make this roster and compete, but only one of them are going to have the opportunity to do so. So let's start off with Stephen Gilmore, a standout player in the 2023 preseason, a standout player with Marshall as a collegiate athlete, and a player that a lot of people love to have on this roster, right? In 61 games with the Thundering Herd, Stephen Gilmore had 200 tackles, 6.5 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks, 9 interceptions, one of those going for a pick six, with 35 passes defended and 3 forced fumbles. In the 2023 preseason, Stephen Gilmore finished with 10 tackles, 2 interceptions, one of which he returned for a touchdown in the Lions' final preseason game. He was super impressive, super impactful on the defensive side of the ball. And honestly, I think probably should have got a little more work last year. I think he should have gotten an opportunity with the struggles that this secondary was having. And I know that as a Super Bowl contender, you don't want to rely on an undrafted rookie free agent. But when your secondary is struggling to the point where the Lions was, where Kendallvilder is your cornerback one and Jerry Jacobs is your cornerback one and Cam Sutton is struggling, I think Stephen Gilmore could have had a really good opportunity to make an impact. And honestly, I don't think it could have been any worse than what the Detroit Lions were putting on the field last year. But unfortunately, with all of the restructurings and all of the changes this year, Stephen Gilmore is on the outside looking in. And compared to some of the other veterans on this roster, he might not have the edge anymore to make this roster as cornerback 6. Now, the next player we're going to take a look at is going to be Khalil Dorsey, a player that is still very young, still very impactful for the Detroit Lions. And even though he missed roughly a month of the season last year, Khalil Dorsey is one of the coaching staff's favorites. He played 13 games a season ago for the Lions, only had 11 tackles, but was a special teams ace, flew down the field in coverage, was able to hit and tackle, and he is a practice squad type of player. I think he's a guy that a lot of teams won't look at as a potential option. But just being a special teams ace, being so impactful for the Detroit Lions on the third side of the ball, I think Khalil Dorsey does have a really good opportunity to be on the roster because they have 5 cornerbacks that can cover. They have 4 safeties that can cover. I think that special teams versatility is going to be massive in Khalil Dorsey's campaign to make this roster. And honestly, I think he can do it if he stands out at cornerback, which he has throughout OTAs, already having 2 pick sixes throughout OTAs in minicamp. And then the last player we're going to take a look at is Kendallvilder, a 5-year pro, starter in 2023, 10 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, 2 passes defended, and a forced fumble. Kendallvilder, I think, made the most out of a poor opportunity. I don't think Kendallvilder should be a starter for any NFL team next year or probably ever, right? Obviously, he's a good NFL player. He made the NFL. He's a 5-year pro, made a lot of plays for a lot of teams. But just watching the film last year, Kendallvilder probably isn't the guy you want starting on the boundary, probably isn't the guy you want to be your cornerback 1. He could be a really strong depth piece if you're talking cornerback 5, cornerback 6. That's a great depth piece in a young veteran player with a lot of experience. But he's a player that just wasn't great for the Detroit Lions a season ago. Gave up a lot of touchdowns, gave up a lot of yards, wasn't phenomenal. Did make a couple of plays here and there for sure. I thought I had a great game in Dallas, but other than that, really struggled throughout the season to stay consistent and stay incredibly impactful. So based off of those 3 options, right, because I don't think that Garnes and Strickland will beat out any of the 4 safeties we talked about, nor will CJ Moore, although I think CJ Moore will be a practice squad player for the Detroit Lions after his suspension. Now, the only safety I could see really making a push for this roster is going to be CJ Moore, a player that played 56 games for the Detroit Lions over the last 4 years, has 48 tackles, an interception, a fumble recovery, 2 passes defended, and is a special teams ace. However, I think after the suspension that he served last season, I think after not playing for an entire year, the market for CJ Moore isn't going to be that large. I don't think he's going to get much looks as a safety. He could get some looks as a special teams player, but I think this is one of those guys that the Lions could potentially store on the practice squad, isn't going to have the hype, isn't going to have the name, isn't going to really be a standout if he does get cut, right? I think a lot of people are going to look at, oh, CJ Moore, waived by the Detroit Lions, didn't play at all last year due to suspension, is really just a special teams contributor, doesn't bring anything to the secondary. I think they could find a way to stash CJ Moore on the practice squad and still have that special teams ace while not having to use an entire roster spot. And I think he could be one of those guys that sticks on the roster early due to maybe a Mosley being on the PUP list to start the season. So I think CJ Moore might start the season as a Detroit Lion, but potentially won't end it on the Detroit Lions active roster. So with those four options, where do the Detroit Lions go? Personally, I think the Detroit Lions final depth chart looks like this. I think it's Davis, Arnold, Robertson, Rakestraw, Mosley, and I think Khalil Dorsy makes it as the final player on this cornerback room. As much as I like Stephen Gilmore, I just don't think he brings the special teams versatility that Khalil Dorsy does. And I think Khalil Dorsy is just one of those players the Lions are going to keep around for better or worse. He's a great special teams contributor, a really good leader. And after losing one of their best gunners a season ago in Chase Lucas, I don't think they're going to want to replace Khalil Dorsy with a younger player. I think Khalil Dorsy is exactly who they want on the secondary. And honestly, Khil Dorsy has been really good throughout training camp, really good throughout minicamp and OTAs, multiple pick sixes, lots of passes defended, flying to the football, making some big plays. And I think he's a guy that the Lions are going to keep giving chances because he's just the type of player that they really, really like. And then, obviously, as the secondary stays the same as the safeties go, Joseph, Ifiatu, Branch, and Joseph yet again. Those four guys are going to probably be the starting four safeties, and I think you will have some on the practice squad, but I don't think you carry five safeties into the NFL season, meaning the practice squad is going to be Gilmore, Garnes, Strickland, and I think CJ Moore as well. Garnes and Strickland, I think, are pretty easy to put on the practice squad if they look good enough in the preseason. Gilmore is a player that could get stolen away, but again, a player that has never played in an NFL regular season game. A really young secondary, a really, potentially lesser secondary as far as just overall team building goes. A weaker secondary could, I think, add Stephen Gilmore and have a good opportunity, but I think he's another guy that could potentially slip through the cracks. And then again, CJ Moore coming off of that suspension will have very little hype around him, and I just don't think he will get picked up either. So I think the secondary in the practice squad could have a couple of key pieces as well, being Gilmore and Moore, but as of right now, that is kind of how I see the Lions secondary working out. I think Dorsey makes it as that final roster spot. I think this is a far improved secondary from a year ago with a lot of playmakers, a lot of good pieces, and a secondary that can make the Detroit Lions defense feared once again. But with all that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. That is my predictions for the depth chart and the cornerback roster battle. But let me know down in the comments below your opinions. Who do you think makes it as that last cornerback? Do you have different safety picks than me? I'd be very curious what you guys have to say. But with all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching. And if you have not done so already, please click the subscribe button down below. If you love Detroit Lions content, you like the Detroit Lions daily news and updates, click the subscribe button down below. It helps the channel out a ton. I will keep putting out Detroit Lions content. Make sure that you never miss a Detroit Lions video again. Hit the subscribe button and the bell notification. We're shooting for 4,000 subscribers by training camp. We are less than 50 away. So help us hit that goal. It would help us out a ton. But with all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so very much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.